Okay, where to start? So, first of all, I have to say thank you to the organizers, Mirabel and Gunish, all of the Turkish colleagues. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to chat and play catch up with different people. I have to say, I never expected it to be so powerful to see each week all the faces of Neolithic colleagues, people working, not Neolithic colleagues, but obviously people working in the Neolithic. And to see all of those faces, it's very satisfying, and it's just a great thing to be able to have this kind of conversation. Trevor and I went back and forth this morning about that, and just the fact that this has really contributed towards sort of the intellectual life and sort of this sense of engagement with issues. So great stuff. It's really neat to see, and it's really nice to see all the colleagues that are here at this point. So I want to start today by quickly, and unfortunately, why did it not advance? Let's try this.
Just use your keyboard.
Okay. Yeah, no, I had to move the cursor over from the other screen. So to start this, I just want to briefly recognize a few people, picking up from Doug Baird, and recognize sort of a couple colleagues who have been instrumental in sort of my world and the world that I've intersected with in terms of the Neolithic. That includes Gary, Mirabon, Ofer, who of course all of us miss in many, many ways. It's great to see them, just even pictures here, Mirabon, where I was able to dig out pictures of all of you in your natural and wild Neolithic lifeways, shall we say, in some form. It's also interesting, I went to go find a picture of Trevor. And the backstory here is years ago, Trevor and I spent some time in Lyon when we were both there, and there was a train strike in France, which of course one does and sees all the time. So Trevor and I spent the better part of a day walking around, having coffee, going for lunch, having something else. And we spent the whole day just chatting about everything and anything. And then much to my amazement, this morning when I went to find a picture of Trevor on the web, I found this one, which I found brilliant, because there's Trevor giving a serious lecture of some form. And this was the illustration that was plotted with it, which in some ways, Trevor, I think really epitomizes some of what you do. And that is, it is thinking on different levels, and it's thinking about the pluses, the minuses, things that many of us wouldn't necessarily engage with in some form. And both in terms of our time in Lyon, but also just in the literature, I really enjoy the way you bring us to new ideas in different places. So my thanks to you there. I want to talk today about something that I've been thinking about a lot. And this is something that is a work in progress in many different ways. It's one of trying to think about some aspects of storage and to try and pull apart some of these pieces of storage and think through a few ideas. It's going to be somewhat confused in places. It's probably going to be a little bit sloppy in places, but it's an attempt to try and understand some of the dimensions of storage, why it's so important, how we probably have under-theorized it, how we really are not doing a great job about thinking about it, and trying to think in terms of how can we refocus some attention towards that. And so to do that, the inspiration of this comes in some ways from a statement from Stephen Leacock, where he talked about the sensational moments of famine, writing, he was a political scientist in the 1920s and a great humorist. And the argument that is embedded in the statement that he had is that in many ways, evolutionary change comes from some of these sensational moments of famine, food insecurity, hardship, and that we have to think about some of these. And while he didn't write about it in the context of sort of daily decision-making, daily life, I think there's a real element that we have to think in terms of daily actions and what are the implications of daily actions vis-a-vis long-term patterns. And that's where I want to think a little bit about that and sort of some of those different pieces and bridging some of the different pieces to sort of connect together. So let's think for a second about, if we sort of scale back and think about what are some of the characteristics associated with the development of Neolithic villages. Well, there's a number of different parts of these, all of which we sort of somewhat touched upon in these talks. One, of course, is some degree of sedentism, some degree of high population density, and that's a variable one that we really need to wrestle with. The ability to store foods, some kind of high resource diversity, processing and harvesting technology, and good potential domesticates. Obviously, I want to think in terms of food storage and how that sort of fits with things and how that leads us on. Let's think a little bit about literature. We know in some ways that food storage is important. We can see this in terms of the articles we write. Some excellent articles that have dealt with it. But in many ways, these pieces of work are still very thin. Our engagement with the subject is very thin. And that is that in some ways, the kind of conversations we're having are very dispersed, very sort of dispersed in different ways, and not necessarily really drilling down to some of the key issues. And I want to think in terms of some of the things that we're missing in terms of how we're approaching this, how we can probably reframe some of this, and maybe thinking in terms of some avenues for where we need to think about going as a group of archaeologists and prehistorians. So what are the different pieces to this? Well, one of them that I want to talk about right off is that of what's going on in terms of other professions. Because what we see is that with other professions, such as in many ways, the kind of work that's being done with economic, paleoeconomics in some form, are thinking about evolutionary models for the Neolithic transition. This is a really big one from 1914 with sort of very powerful modeling in terms of what's taking place and the different components to this. It is very much a computational modeling. Here's one of the pieces to it, how surplus affects individuals, the framing of carrying capacity. And yet, if you look at it closely, and I went and I did a search on this to look at the word storage, food storage. The word is used once in this article. It is essentially forgotten about. Everything is framed as that somehow there's a surplus, and then when you have surplus, you can do all this mathematical modeling. But there's no real definition of surplus. There's no connection really to food, and there's no real moment where you say, now you have enough food that you can actually say, I have a surplus. So it's just left that somehow storage, surplus, all these things, it becomes this binary moment of either you have it or you don't have it, rather than thinking about it in terms of gradations. And that's a really important issue because we know that there are different pieces to storage and different components. Where is this talk going? Well, a couple different pieces to it. First of all, I want to think about what's the materiality of plant storage. And some of you are going to have to excuse me here. I'm going to be thinking in terms of plants. I'm not going to be talking about animals. I recognize right off that this is an incredibly important element to think about storage. That is the interconnectivity between plant and animal storage. But I'm going to focus my conversation in terms of plant storage, just because I think you're going to see where the modeling is going and why I want to go in that particular direction. Other piece that I want to talk about is really thinking about how do we model storage planning? This is one of those topics that we've really skated around. We haven't thought in terms of what's going on with storage planning. I also want to think in terms of shelf life of plant foods in a stored context, and how does this impact what we do? I also want to think about how can we think about the scale of storage, not just presence and absence. And this is where things are going to get a little dicey as we start skating through this. And last of all, thinking a little bit in terms of the interconnectivity with plants and animals in some form. So let's think about shelf life. And this, of course, is the backstory to things such as drying, preparation, etc. But thinking about food insecurity and thinking about the back of this. So let's think, what is food storage? I'm going to argue that in some ways we need to define storage as being the purposeful investment of curation of material items with the intent for later use. Now, the big piece to this, as you can see with the refrigerator on the shot there, is that ultimately food storage is all about time. It's all about how we store foods to get over bad periods. We recognize all those pieces, but we also have to recognize that food has a shelf life. It can't just be stored like Hostess Twinkies or something else. It just can't be stored indefinitely. It has a point, a shelf life. And that doesn't matter whether you're talking about animals, where they die natural death, or whether you talk about plants, where you harvest them, but then they go rotten. There's still an element of time that's embedded in our handling of those. The other part to it is that food storage is all about the goals. What are you trying to achieve with food storage? What's the intent of this? How do we think about that? And in terms of, again, coming back to time, is the goal one of that you have enough food for the next week, for the next month, the next year, multiple years? That's important. And when you start looking at ethnographic sources about that, it gets really complex and very interesting when you start realizing that there's a whole series of different goals, and it's important for us to sort of touch base on that. Now, the other part to this is that we have to recognize that as archaeologists, we deal with data, at least those of us that are sort of rooted in the positivist sciences in some form. And that is, the challenge is that food storage can be material, it can be immaterial, both in terms of the containers that we use, the contents that are there. And as the fourth part that sort of picks up with this, we are essentially, when we are in those positions of finding some remarkable food storage facility in some archaeology site, we are essentially excavating the empty refrigerators. We're not counting what was in those refrigerators in the past. And that's one of the challenges when we start trying to model and start trying to think about the different pieces to this. So let's come across, this is in some ways where our conversation is situated. This is a piece of work, and I'm going to indicate a number of different pieces, sort of following on from what Doug Baird was doing the other week. I've got a number of things that I've got up here that are unpublished. They're either going to be going into press, or it's a matter that they're still in work in some form. But I want to give you a sense of where my thinking is with some of these pieces. And this is probably a good way to do that. So when we're thinking about food storage, in many ways, I'm thinking in terms of this area, this red box in the center. In that if we think about some kind of transition that's going from wild and gathering, hunting and gathering of wild resources, small scale camps, moving across through low level food production, and eventually getting to something that we feel more comfortable talking about as an agricultural economy, large scale, sedentary village of some form. This also has implications in terms of things such as the household and the nature of the transition from single family to multifamily household, the transition from seasonal food insecurity to greater food security, the transition from immediate consumption to delayed consumption, and in some ways that of also from storage taking place outside of places to inside of places. So in many ways, the conversation that I'm thinking about is really at this point of time, and this for all intents and purposes, that's the Neolithic. That's where we're wrestling with these as we try and think about these interlinked and codependent variables as we try and sort of explore those and think how they fit together in different ways. Here's another piece to this, and this is more of an observation. In many ways, when we write about plant storage, in some ways, we're talking about plant storage the same way we would talk about a gas pump. We're not talking about food storage as a refrigerator. The difference is really one of, if you think of something like a gas pump, it's really thinking about that you have something that is stable. It can sit in the ground for multiple years with no problem. It's a form of fuel. It's a form of energy in some form. This is really good in terms of modeling, but really this doesn't connect to the biological deterioration that we know that takes place with food. But when you start looking at it, in some ways, that's often how we write about food storage, is in that kind of antiseptic way, rather than thinking about it in terms of refrigerators and thinking about it in terms of that we have, again, looking at this illustration, we have lots of containers. We have variable shelf life with things in there. We have something that is rotten in the back. We have other things less so. Some things preserve better, some things less. That's in many ways the reality of what we were dealing with in the Neolithic. The challenge is that while that's sensitive to the physical realities of food, that makes us really overlook a series of complex, it requires a number of complex operational assumptions for modeling. And that's one of the challenges, is how do we somehow encapsulate some degree of reality in our models and in our language that recognizes that piece? I haven't figured that out, by the way. It's just a matter of how we think about it. Let's think a little bit more about some of the other pieces to this. And that is, there's many aspects to food storage that we really haven't pushed forward with. We haven't really thought about. One is issues of access to storage areas. There's been some work that's dealt with that. Amy Bogart has written about it. I've written about it a little bit as well. The whole aspect of where do we have things that there's some element of control, there's monitoring, restricted, unrestricted. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's an important one for us to continue to engage with as a topic. Another one that's very difficult is that of essentially volume of storage. What kind of physical spaces exist? And what does that mean in terms of communities, in terms of households versus communities? Again, the celebrated, I've forgotten the article by Amy and company, it was called Celebrated Surplus or something like this. I can't remember the title of it. That's one of the ones that has looked at sort of storage containers and looked at it from Chata and some of the different pieces there. Another aspect to this that is relatively new and we haven't really dived into it is thinking in terms of things such as what's the caloric capacity? What's the payoff for storing food in containers? What is the result of, much the same way as if you buy a container that has a hamburger in it, you know that there's a certain amount of value for that, something that's going to go inside of you. But we haven't really operationalized that. We haven't really explored that in some ways. And I think there's much more potential to that than we have recognized. And that in some ways comes back to the issue of trying to pull apart the question of our terminology of talking about a normal storage practices, an excess in some form versus a surplus, which is something that in my world is something you no longer need to consume it. It's a matter that you can sell it, you can give it away, you can use it in some capacity. So in some ways, thinking a little bit more in terms of that gradation of scale and what that tells us, what that means for us. So let's think about this a little bit more. There is an immateriality to storage, which is very complicated. In some cases, we have features, bins in the ground, pits in the ground, bins in the corners of units. We have certain areas such as the corner of a building. You can see in this Hopi illustration, black and white photograph of where you have corn that's stacked in the corner. In other places on rooftops where you see chilies drying. So we know that storage is taking place in different contexts. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about meat or whether we're talking about plant. We know that storage at times, or the processing at least, is something that's temporary. And that's a challenge to us as we start trying to think through these different pieces and then start to think in terms of where can we go with that? What can we do with that in some form? What we have to recognize, of course, is there's a lot of complexity to this. There's a lot of material manifestations. And the challenge is, where do we draw on ethnography? Where do we draw on archaeology? And where do we feel comfortable with some of the operational assumptions that are involved in some of this? Here's one example of this. And this is important in terms of that I think the comparative context matters. I think it means an awful lot to us. So here's one piece to this. This is up above, you can see Gary. And a number of years ago, he wrote a paper dealing with shrines and dealing with locations at Ain Ghazal, and made the argument that this piece that you see here, this fascinating building, there's actually two of them, that these were some form of ritual structure. And I very much thought of it on that level and have written about it at different points that way. And then a number of years ago, I went back to that photograph and I started looking at it and thinking about it. This is one of a circular structure that's plastered. It has walls coming up, it has a hole in the center, it has sort of vent ports that come through, they come into the center. And Gary and I had always talked about it along the lines of this was some form of shrine or some place like a mini kiva where people would go, something. And I started to rethink that. And I now really wonder whether that is something that was related to food processing, to drying in some capacity. I don't know. But the point is, in this kind of situation, both of us are developing these arguments on the basis of the common understanding of the material culture, trying to explore it and engaging in a constructive way about the kind of what may have taken place in that particular place. That contrasts very strongly, in my view, with the kind of dialogue that we see in other contexts. There's a paper that Brian Hayden came out in 2021, that is called Archaeological Pitfalls of Storage, in which he sort of does away with that kind of comparative context, and he starts thinking in terms of salmon from the Natufian, and he starts talking in terms of the visibility and invisibility of storage vis-a-vis things such as rice in Asia. And that becomes a framework for then interpreting social inequality in the Natufian in the Near East. That's where things start falling apart, as far as I'm concerned, is that there's not this connection to the kind of archaeology, the material culture, and in some ways, the application of these ideas become fairly weak in some of these points. So context matters. I think it matters an awful lot at that point, actually. Okay, let's think in terms of planning and some of the different pieces to this. So first of all, if we accept that stored foods are used to get over poor harvest cycles, and I think that's the bottom line in some ways. What we know at this point is that in terms of storage planning, when we look at ethnography, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Greek villagers, the American Southwest, other places where you have traditional storage systems that are being used, what we find is that when people have talked to the farmers, when they've talked to the household members, they are storing not just for the winter, they're storing for 18 to 24 months, sometimes 3 years. So they're planning to try and put stuff away in the event that the next year is a real crisis. So they're trying to do this in a way that they're creating a buffer, and that buffer is in place, and that they have that as a minimum target in some form. This is driven by the fact that spoilage rates are incredibly high at some points. This is one example that was written about in some dry climate studies. Seeds stored in pits suffer losses approaching 90%. And there's two dimensions. One is, when can you still eat something? Second part to it is, when can you plant something? And those are two different dimensions, but interconnected in some form. So we have different accounts, and we know that in some cases things go well, in other cases they don't go well. And we need to know more about that. The bottom line is that I would argue that people in the past were having to put away a lot more food just so they had enough for the lean season. So let me go shoot through some of this and talk about those little pieces. So first of all, what's the point? Why did people use silos, bins, rooms? Why did they put stuff in baskets and put them into certain locations? What's being done that way? Well, it's not a big surprise. It's a matter that it creates, it moderates the temperature variability that takes place. It reduces the humidity. It protects from rodents. Presumably it protects from insects. It has the potential to protect from other humans. Depending on how you're storing things, ventilation, it will also protect vis-a-vis things such as fungus or other bacterial agents in some form. So we know that there's a use to these, and it's essentially one of moderating variation in some capacity. What's interesting is that we can push this further. We can actually think about it further in terms of some of the different components and the different pieces. So here's one example. one example that I've drawn upon at different points. And that is there's a good bit of research that has looked at replicative work that has looked at storage in different places in the world, East Africa, Central Africa, other contexts. This is one particular piece of work where they looked and they put a series of sensors in a series of traditional pits. And these are comparable to what you'd see in a pit feature just about anywhere in a Neolithic tell, I would imagine. So what they then did is they put these sensors in different places within the pits. They put them close to the walls, in the center of the pits, at the bottom. And what you find is that the preservation starts going off soonest at the bottom, then on the walls, and last on the inside. What they also were able to identify is that really there is a threshold, and the threshold is usually about 13.5% humidity. Below that, you're in good shape and you can store things for a good period of time. The moment things go beyond that, you run into trouble, and that's where failure starts occurring. So think of the red in this illustration as being that kind of failure line. This has been independently confirmed by a lot of research that has taken place. There's this wonderful, wonderful journal called the Journal of Stored Products Research. How could you get anything more exciting than a Journal of Stored Products Research? And this is essentially the journal that you can find out. It's a very scary journal in some ways because it goes through and tells you about what do rodents do, what does fungus do, bacterial action, all essentially one of human attempts through gas, temperature, or other things to mitigate the spoilage of modern commodities for commercial value. So there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of research that's done in this. And what they show is 13.5 degrees. That's the target. If you're going above that, you're in trouble. So this is helpful. This helps us understand some of the different pieces to this. It also helps us understand, and this is some replicative work on the left-hand side here that you can see. It also shows you, helps us understand that in some ways when we start modeling, and what I've done in this illustration on the right-hand side is modeled what's taking place, where you can see that red zone on the outside where spoilage is likely to take place. The preservation in those kinds of situations is less than a year. In other areas, it will go, the yellow areas, it will go longer. In other areas still, it will last even longer than that. But keep in mind, this is a commodity that's filled the whole thing. This is not a matter of individual baskets with commodities inside. Either way, it helps us understand what's going on in some of these places. And that's helpful when we think about the individual pit feature and what's going on with those. I think it's also helpful when we start thinking about various Neolithic sites, because we can think about this little piece that was published. This is from Chata with the storage features that Amy and company were writing about. And what you can see in this particular context is that instead of thinking about those as bins, really what we probably should be thinking about is that those were areas that were filled with baskets, and that these baskets are filled with commodities that are baking off at different points of time. So this is really in some ways thinking about the baskets such as the recent fascinating Neolithic basket found in Israel recently, and thinking in terms of what's likely to be going on in those spaces. And in some ways thinking about those bin areas as refrigerators where people were probably living in a constant situation of one messy basket full of stuff that had gone off, another basket of grain that was in good shape, another basket of emmer wheat that was doing fine. And we have to think about it with that kind of nuance. Even if we don't have that data from a material standpoint, probably we need to turn our mindset to that so that we can understand those different pieces. Here's another little interesting piece to this. And that is in some world areas now, we're getting good information that shows that you don't have a single crop stored in a single pit feature. Instead, they're lining pit features with certain things. And what's interesting is that some of them, and it's not just a matter that they are like straw or something else that provides a buffer in some form, it's now becoming quite plausible that some of this is being done to either increase the production of CO2, which therefore changes the storage environment, or it's a matter that there's something else going on with things such as the big blue stem, that when you line these pits, that there's other biochemical things that are going on, and that's changing the storage environment, and that's either something that's antifungal, anti-insect, or something that changes with more CO2 in there in some capacity. So that's an interesting development. It's one that nobody's really thought through at this point, but I also think it's really important. Here's another little aspect to this, and that is we now know that temperature and humidity are critical. And there's a couple Neolithic sites where people, Miraban, Gunesh, Doug Baird, are doing work to try and understand temperature and humidity work. That's interesting, and it's important because it means that we have to think about the house as not just a place where people sleep, but it's a place where if you keep it dry, you can change the storage environment. So one little piece that is incidental, I've been doing some work in Ireland, in some ways comes similar to this, that looks at the origins of the chimney. And one of the things that we did in this particular case is did some longitudinal runs with instruments looking at temperature and looking at burn rates for fire and what's going on in terms of humidity. And what you can see from this chart on the bottom is that it's one of those things that once you've warmed up a house, humidity levels drop down, and from that point, you can maintain things in such a way where even a situational fire will keep things dry and keep a better environment. So we have to think about it as that there's a purpose. There's potentially a purpose to fires as well, beyond that of sort of cooking food and doing other things. But by keeping a dry environment, that's creating the context for better preservation in the long term. So that's another a little interesting piece to think about. Timescales and goals are another thing that I think are really interesting and to think about. And the background to this comes from a question that I posed as part of an article that I wrote. And the question being, when is enough really enough in terms of storage? I don't think we're anywhere close to knowing that. And yet that's really important, whether we're talking about health, whether we're talking about some form of potential surplus that somebody could use in some form, whether we're talking about independence of a household and household autonomy. The whole question of when is enough really enough is really critical. And I don't think we've really wrestled with it. Let me give you one example of this. So here's a chart up above that I published in that same article that works under the impression that is modeling if an individual needs 100 units of food to be able to, let's assume that this is all the plant food, that it's stored below the ground in some kind of pit feature, and that somebody needs 100 units of food over the period of a year. We have to calculate this out a little bit further. If you need 100 units, you need to recognize that if it's plants in some form that you have to use seed from, then you're going to have to hold back probably 15% of it. So you'll see there, then you actually need 115 units of stored food so that you're ready to go. Now, the other part to it is, what about loss rate? If you're estimating that 20% of your food is lost in a year, then you actually need 138 units. If you're estimating 35% lost, then you actually need now 155.3 units that are stored. This is not calculating 60% loss or some of these other scenarios. These are actually a 20 and 35% loss rate, I would argue, is actually fairly conservative. Okay, so what happens if that's what you need in the way of food? What if you want to store, you need it for 1 year and you want to get 1 year's reserve? Well, then you need either 276 units or 310. What if you want to store 2 years worth? And I've identified that as moderate risk in some form. Well, you need 400 plus units or 465 units of that. If that's all going into the ground, and if it takes, if all those units are going into the ground, all the materials going into the ground, then that means that you're essentially needing to store 4 times as much units / food than you actually to make sure you've met your goal to get through. Now think about it in terms of number of pits and what that means. These are just examples from the American Southwest, and we could just as easily talk about Iron Age England or LBK or something similar. But if you look in these illustrations with these different pits, what you see here, for example, the one on the far left here of the screen, you can see these pit houses, which are the rectangular structures. The dark black areas are burials. And then these circular areas in front of the buildings are the pits that are there, pits and hearths in some form. So what that suggests to me is that we need to rethink, rather than just saying, wow, that's a lot of pits, and therefore they had a lot of food, and therefore they had enough food to be able to share or to do something else with, essentially using the framing of a surplus in some form. We need to rethink that, because just based on scaling up and the footprint that results from scaling up with this kind of a goal, that changes things enormously, changes things in a number of different ways. Let's think about it on another standpoint as well. Let's think about it coming down in scale. We've been thinking about these bigger pieces. Let's think about it on a smaller scale and thinking about it a single year. Thinking of it as an annual period of when do we have food insecurity and risk. This is a piece of work that I did many a year ago, looking at the availability of subsistence resources going from low to high and months of the year. And this is on the plateau. It was looking at plants and animals, things such as salmon, and then various plants that were available. And you can see here going from November to October, just charting out the month of the year and looking at the frequency. And essentially what you see here, that sort of that stippled zone in the center, that's where you're having stored food going into a particular, going into that. And then essentially that becomes used up. And you're in a situation where you have lean months before the salmon come back, before plants are available again, where you have the least availability. That's the period of risk that's involved. So that's trying to think about it as sort of an annual cycle in what's going on. A couple years ago, I rethought that and re-engaged with this with a different context. This was looking at a site in Medellin Prairie, in Illinois around here, and thinking about what was likely to take place. This is a more, from my standpoint, this is a more satisfying way to think about it. Thinking about it as a yearly cycle going through in terms of when do you have high availability, things like in the summer, when you have corn, beans, other things that are available, squash, nuts and berries, acorns, harvesting of shellfish. Then things in the fall going with the filling in of subsurface pit features and storing them. And then in some ways, relying on available wild animals at some point, but really nothing during the winter months. So thinking of it from sort of November through until March, April, somewhere in that zone. And that eventually you start using up your supply. And it gets to a point where that means that at some point you have a greater period of risk and insecurity that takes place until spring takes place. I think we have a good idea of what's going on at this particular point of time. I have no idea what's going on at different points of time in the Neolithic. And I think this is the kind of thing that would be really productive, sort of as a gentle hint to Neolithic plant and animal people, to think about how can we bring together some of this expertise to think about annual moments, thinking about it in a very particular temporal and geographical context because of the variability that we know exists, but thinking in terms of how do we put our heads together and sort of wrestle with that and understand these different pieces. We can scale that up. Also thinking about if that was a year cycle, what about when we think about food insecurity vis-a-vis something that's bigger, something where we know there are famines in some capacity? In this particular case, a piece of work looking in Ireland, an area where I've been working as well. And thinking about, in this case, the blue chart is population. This is through time over about the last 200 years or so, 300 years. And thinking about those moments of time, what we know there were distinct famines that were recognized. In most of these cases, at least 3 years of famine. So 1879 to 1882, 1847 to 1850. Interesting is that when you start looking at newspaper accounts between those famine years, what you end up finding is that there's a lot of evidence for episodic food stress that is taking place. So the whole question of a famine year versus a good year, there's no such thing as a good year. It's just a matter of a year that you either have less, more, and you get through. You can probably start thinking about the Neolithic that way as well. So thinking about it longer term, when we start rolling out the scale for 30 years and what that potentially means. I guess the thing that'd be really interesting is thinking about it in terms of something long-term, 500-year cycles. For those of you that watched Doug Baird's presentation the other day, there was some really neat stuff where he had plant and animal material. They're starting to think about that. Louise, that's a great site where you folks, and Doug, you folks should be able to start engaging with those kinds of things. And it would be fascinating eventually that we get to a point where we can start thinking about how does that modeling change from different points of time in different locations? And what's that telling us in terms of adaptation in these particular contexts? Sorry, I missed one. Let me come back to it. Here we go. So let's think about some of the other different little pieces here. And that is thinking about movement from storage from outside areas to inside of buildings, where they're storing plants, and thinking about scale through time. So this is an illustration. This is one of those crazy things one does when you start preparing a talk. I started trying to get my head around an older illustration I used where I looked at extramural storage and the transition, as you see in green, from extramural storage to intramural storage, which I think is a good foundation. We have an understanding of that. And somehow in one of the other illustrations I published, looking at going from low volume storage to high volume storage. And I went back to that and I started layering out in gray, you can see down at the base of this, thinking about that we've got some kind of probably community focused sharing with bins and silos, eventually bins and internal divisions, sort of Shikling Kuijt level 2, somewhere in that area, level 3. Then thinking about restrictive household sharing and dedicated rooms and internal divisions of rooms. Again, at Shikling Kuijt or Chatal having good examples of that, or Khan Hashan as another example of that. But as I started going through that and thinking about the difference between Southern Levant and Anatolia and putting this together in some form, I started realizing that I was less and less comfortable with the whole aspect of scale. How do we know high volume storage versus low volume? How do we wrestle with that in some? As an attempt that I've been playing with over the years that Amy and Mike Charles saw a number of years ago in Vancouver. And I'm sort of going back to it and thinking about how can we potentially wrestle with some of these different components. And this is where I'm going to take us now. I'm going to focus on the Southern Levant, and I'm not going to go into detail in terms of what different features. What I've done is try to look at representative features from different points of time from the Southern Levant. So Wadi Hama, Ain Malaha, Dra, Natif, Du, Jericho, different sites from the Natufian and PPNA, then other sites that were representative of the middle PPNB, and then other sites that were representative of the late PPNB. I haven't done this in terms of Anatolia, but I think it's broadly similar, to be honest, given the kind of patterning. I think we're seeing the same kind of patterns. If you just flashing back here for a second, when we see these transitions between bins and internal divisions to that of community-focused bins and silos outside, I think we're seeing the broadly the same kinds of things going on. Now, there's going to be flux between it. There's going to be differences, but I think the same kind of thing is going on. So rather than going through step by step and with these, what I'm going to suggest is let me show you what the results are telling you, what the assumptions are, and looking at some of the strengths, the weaknesses to that, and then talking about the overall picture. I think the big thing this is helping us understand is if we look at the magnitude, this actually shows us an interesting pattern. Even if we quibble about the assumptions about, is this a bin that would have been this tall versus this tall, this size? When we look at the magnitude, it starts showing us some things. And that's what I want to focus on in here. Okay, so let's look at this for a second. So what I've done is just looking at published information in terms of site size for these. This will look familiar to you in terms of average size of some of these different sites, PPNA, middle PPNB, LPPNB. And then what I've done is I've essentially scaled down the LPPNB sites. And I've done this for a couple different reasons. One is that I think there's some questions that can be raised in terms of what is contemporary and the sort of contemporaneity of some of these buildings. The whole question of why do we have so many buildings is a good one. I've just, as I say, for shits and giggles, I've scaled this down in terms of total area that's occupied at any one point in time. It doesn't change things dramatically. If anything, it actually accentuates the end product. So it doesn't change the pattern in any form. But so just to be clear, okay, if we then use that as a proxy, and there's different ways to do this statistically, but if we use it as a proxy for population size in these, we can think in terms of the kind of transition that's taking place from the PPNA, middle PPNB, and late PPNB. Recognizing this is an averaging. So we have some PPNA sites that are larger than other ones. This is an averaging, and we're thinking about the overall trajectory of what's taking place. And in many ways, the sort of social packing, especially with the LPPNB and later on. We can convert that in a real simple way, thinking in terms of people per hectare. We can basically do that in such a way where now we can go and look at something comparable, a physical space from an archaeological site. So let's do that. There we go. So let's do that. And now flipping over in terms of these different sites from different points of time, going through there, and then looking at it in terms of storage volume. And what I'm doing here is essentially looking for pits, looking for bins in the corners of rooms. In some cases, like in Gazal, there's a few places where you have post holes that probably were some kind of scaffolding where things could be stored in there, or looking at small rooms that would have potentially been used for storage. Now, the challenge here, and this is one of the big assumptions in all of this, the challenge here is we could also have dung storage in some of those areas. You could have wood storage for fuel. You could have food that's being stored there. We don't entirely know. And that's one of the challenges as we play these kind of statistical games. What happens when we start looking at these numbers and what goes on? What ends up going on is that we end up with a ratio, thinking about ratio of meters cubed storage per person. And we can then take a look at that. It ends up kicking out a modified ratio for us and looking at that. Here's the interesting part to that. As background, this is one of the interesting pieces to this. This is some interesting work that I got from World Health Organization over the years, and looking at what is the storage weight of different commodities, barley, emmer wheat, lentil, horse beans are the ones that I've looked at. And then thinking in terms of what's the caloric yield for those? And then what's the caloric yield if you're consuming 85% of that? Human body works in such a way where if I eat a 1,000-calorie Big Mac, actually I'm only going to process about 85% of that caloric value. The rest of it gets shot out. So there's a reduction that takes place. What's interesting, if you look in that last column there, is that there's a huge payoff for lentil and horse beans compared to wheat and barley. So that's another interesting aspect of now starting to think in terms of, well, it's not just a matter of storing emmer wheat. What's the kicker, what happens when horse beans come on the scene and we have some combination of horse beans and lentil in the diet, and what that means in terms of caloric value for people. So that goes through. Okay, now what I want to do is turn it in terms of numbers of months. And what I'm going to do is just thinking about it in terms of if a person's diet consists of 2,400 calories a day, and I'm just going to throw that out for discussion's sake, that then if we assume that 1,200 calories per day, and we'll call it 50% barley and emmer wheat, and that if that's the goal of storing 1,200 calories per person, and we know storage volume based on the archaeology that we've looked at, we can translate that in terms of number of months. We can translate that in terms of the number of months as well. And what we end up with is something that's interesting. If this system is to be believed, and I think it's telling us some interesting stuff that I think is valuable, that really the number of months of stored food that you're looking at right from the Natufian is very low. It's very low. Now, admittedly, you could have stuff that's stored in trees, you could have it in other places, but again, if we're dealing with the physical sciences and physical remains, this is what we have at the moment. Anything else is conjecture. So by the time we get to the PPNA, we're getting about 16 months, and then it starts really kicking up by the LPPNB. What about if we then turn that around and think about our overall target? If our target is 24 months, if we're thinking about wanting to get to 24 months with this, then we can now look here in terms of that's our target. We're short by 22 months in the Natufian in some form. PPNA, we're short by about 8 months in there. Middle PPNB. By the time we get to the LPPNB, that's where the real value comes out. That's where we really start seeing stuff. And that's where I think you can start making the argument that we're now having some form of significant excess that can be used in some capacity. And this is again calculating minus seed for planting and storage loss. There's an enormous range of assumptions in here, but I think it's telling us something important. And I think the important thing it's telling us is that ultimately, if the shelf life is capped in Neolithic storage, plant storage, if it's capped at, let's call it 24 months plus and minus, and I think there's good reason to believe that's really the best one could hope for, and the variation is probably much more from sort of 18 to 36. But let's call it 24, just for the heck of it. It means that ultimately the production that we're talking about is capped. Sorry, that ultimately, if storage is capped in some form, the thing that's going on in the situation is that it's going to be increased production and harvesting. That's what's filling up the LPPNB baskets and raising carrying capacity. It's not new storage or better ways of storage. Storage can only get people so far. There's some other aspects of this, of course. Again, dung storage, wood, all kinds of other things that could be going on with this. But it is teasing us. It's teasing us with some interesting information that we want to think about. I just got about 3 more slides that I want to go through and sort of wrap up this, thinking about some of the pieces here. One of the things that I find really interesting about thinking about scale of communities and thinking about networks and what's going on is that we have talked about storage in different ways. It's in some ways largely that of particular rooms, particular buildings, maybe a little bit more, but not much. I would suggest that in some ways we need to think about this in a much broader way, and that we need to think in terms of the transition going from the middle PPNB to the LPPNB, and I'll talk about this in just a second, is really probably a fundamental change in the networks of food sharing and storage. This picks up on what Ben's and others have been writing about, and Amy have been writing about as well. And thinking about it in terms of networks as the scale of communities get larger, and as some of these households, those are not just elements of personal relationships that are going back and forth. That's also how food is being shared, because that's one aspect to membership, is essentially making sure you know where your meal is coming from. So I think that's another component to it, is thinking about networks of food sharing and how that may fit together in some form. It also can be looked at in an interesting way. This is an article that Sam Bowles put together a number of years ago called Equality's Fate Towards a Natural History. And it's an article that he talks about what he's called, what is known in sort of paleoeconomics as this phrasing of co-insurance versus self-insurance. And it's really one of thinking about sharing networks, and with co-insurance, which I'm going to argue, I think we can use that as a framework. And that is that we can think about some form of co-insurance where there's community sharing, the networks are based on a broader context, and a shift to something that he's identifying, I think we can use to talk about as self-insurance. And that is where we now have some form of sharing that's really more centered on the individual household, with some form of leadership that's taking place within that. Well, I think there's some dimensions to those little pieces, and I found it productive to think about those pieces. Last thing I really want to sort of highlight in this before a big summary chart is thinking about what does storage mean in terms of health? What does storage mean vis-a-vis that of intergenerational food insecurity and self-insurance in some form? And this is very much, this emerges from literature from a number of different people, Scott being one of those individuals, Clark Larson is another. Another piece to it is thinking about what happens vis-a-vis intergenerational transmission of stress in humans. There's a lot of literature out there now that we see, not just in terms of food, but also in terms of trauma in different ways. And what we see is that there is an intergenerational element to it. And it is something that food insecurity not only results in sort of the physical signs that we see in the human skeleton, but in some ways it probably carried on in such a way where I'm not going to call it a biological leveling mechanism, but one under which it certainly served as a cap. One of the quotes to this to think about is that when one starts looking at the moments of physical evidence for health, problems of health, especially with childhood, what we start to see is that, for example, the work that Tobias Richter and others have done, we see at the early points in the PPNA and the Natufian, we see a substantial evidence for nutritional stress amongst those populations. By the time we get to Chata, we're seeing much less of that. Their argument right here is very simple. Children were born into a relatively healthy environment, certainly one that provided adequate resources and especially access to quality nutrition. That's storage. That's somewhat driven by storage. So the part to take away from that is not only seeing things such as fertility being up, population growth coming up, but also the maternal and adolescent health is probably better compared to earlier periods of the Neolithic. And I would argue it's partially this context of storage. It's probably also something to do with fats, protein, and carbs, and just the sort of management of these different pieces. And thinking about this particular piece, if we want to take the longue durée, take a long period of time looking at population aggregation and looking at carrying capacity, the whole aspect of carrying capacity is fascinating. And we really don't understand what is Neolithic carrying capacity in terms of a village versus a household or anything similar. So if we want to think about these different pieces, we can think of going through time in terms of the PPNA, that some of the hallmarks we can talk about are some forms of low-level plant management, some predominance of immediate consumption of food, probably in a period of weeks because there's a softness with that, and then some form of community sharing networks. We can think of going through time, maybe we're dealing with sort of this roll-on of new technology, how it facilitates, how it reduces, I should say, post-harvest loss, and how the play with new domesticates, ultimately we get some kind of increased food yield. And then we start thinking about sort of plant management, more effective storage, the increased shelf life that takes place, and in some ways, this element of increased delayed consumption and what that means. What's interesting from my standpoint, if you think about sort of a southern versus a northern, let's call it an Anatolian versus a southern Levantine trajectory with these two blue lines here, we have very different patterns that are taking place in the pottery neo by the time we get to this point. We also have a common pattern though, and the common pattern is that, sure, we have some evidence for differential material culture, some evidence for differential treatment of the dead. Do we have really something that we can call clear leadership and sort of identification? I don't think we really do yet. Do we have significant evidence for differential access to housing, to food, to stuff in some form? I don't think we really do yet. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not sure that we're at that point where we can talk about that. So that raises questions in terms of, to what extent should we be talking about leadership and sort of differential elements to this? Okay, what's the takeaway from this and the different little pieces here, just sort of wrapping up? First of all, things that we need to think about more. There's a whole dimension of front and backloaded resource use in storage that we just don't know about. We haven't thought about the kind of time investment necessary to store nuts versus that of wheat, and what's necessary in terms of drying, parching, winnowing, whatever other little elements. That's really important for us to think about. The other pieces to it are thinking about the plant and animal storage interface, modeling and seasonality, and how we do this in some form. I think demography is another really important element to this. We don't really have a good sense of carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is a relationship between the number of people, the amount that's food available. We need to think further about that and how we model things. We need to think more about storage and Neolithic food waste. Human communities today, we waste an enormous amount of food. And in some ways, we haven't thought about that vis-a-vis the Neolithic in some form. We have sort of these economic modeling of these operational machines that basically eat their way across the landscape. But we haven't thought about really issues of waste and some of the other pieces there. I think food sharing networks, Ben's work starts off with some of that in some really good ways, as does Amy's work as well. I think another one that's really interesting is the whole aspect of intergenerational food insecurity and health, and thinking about how might this have worked in the Neolithic, and thinking about those different pieces. And Scott, someday I'd love to, when we get to a post-COVID-19 world, to be able to chat further with you about this. And I guess the last one, and when we think of storage and we think of that's defining a space, putting a commodity inside of it, there's a labor investment into it, is one of sort of access. And in some ways, the whole question of, does that represent property in some capacity? I'm not sure it does. Maybe it does. Maybe it's a yes and no kind of moment. But the whole aspect of what is property versus what is access, I think that can be engaged in by thinking about storage and thinking about some of the different pieces to that. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to see all of your faces again and to chat with you folks, and in some ways to try and work through some of these pieces, these little components in here, to try and wrestle with this and see if we can think about directions that will take us a little further. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. It was excellent talk. You push us to rethink about the space and its variable capacities. Okay, any question? Scott, do you want to add something? Trevor?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. I'm just looking at some of the notes that I scribbled down while you were talking. There's so much to think about there. There's so much to think about. One of the things that was occurred to me was on some of the graphs you used, there was quite a sharp slope from the Tufian PPNA towards middle late PPMB. Yeah, quite a rapid change. Yeah, and I guess you'd drawn those lines deliberately. You could have made a quite smooth straight line or a nice curve. Yeah, but in fact there's a nearly flat line and then a very steep rise, or vice versa. It starts off very high and then goes steeply down. That looks like there's a period of major transition. Yeah, major transformation somewhere around between early middle PPMB. Yeah, would that figure?
Yes, the inspiration for that obviously comes from site size, and that's being used as a way of trying to think about site size and therefore population in some form. There is a dimension to which we have to ask to what extent we are trying to impose order on the past, and in some ways misleading ourselves in some capacity. I have no idea to what extent that's representative of what's going on. I can say that cline that you see is representative of site size, but of course the challenge is that we were then trying to develop arguments on the basis of these material proxies, and then somehow trying to assess the impact and the magnitude of these. And you're totally right, Trevor. It's I'm not saying it's fiction in any capacity, but it's one that we have all these operational assumptions that we're sort of layering into that. And that is one of those key things of, we don't have proxies to really understand to what extent it's a slow, gradual climb in terms of population aggregation, that of carrying capacity. We don't have that at this point. So yeah, it's a real challenge, Trevor.
Yeah, it's for some time it seemed to me that the sites like Jebel Ahmar with its big building with big storage cells in it, which has also got signs of ritual activity and ritual demolition as well at the end, that is in such sharp contrast with the other end of the pre-pottery Neolithic, where it's hypothesized that the storage is within households, maybe within some households for a network of food storage amongst several households, but within households, and that's a major change in the way that the whole economy is managed. If you're starting off where the whole community has got a shared food store, then there must be some kinds of social mechanisms to manage that kind of storage, and that changes very, very greatly when you move towards what you called intramural storage, as opposed to extramural storage. Once you go to intramural storage, then there may be still networks, as you were saying, about networks of food sharing. Some houses being much fuller of storage, and other houses having no apparent storage. But it's a completely different way of socially managing the economic life of the community. And I can't see how you can do a transition from one to the other. It seems to be you have one or you have the other, and that's why I think that's where for me, that's my guess, and that's where your steep lines come from. That there has to be, there can only be a complete transformation, not complete, a very substantial transformation of the social management of resources.
Yeah, and very much a matter of those networks of sharing, and how who comes to dinner, who's invited to dinner. I think that's probably what we're seeing, is that's that transition in some capacity. How we model it, how we talk about it. Yeah, that's still something that we need to have ongoing conversations about.
And just as a little gloss, because I'm so antique, when I was very, very young and only just old enough to take notice of things, which was during the Second World War, when I lived with my mother in a small rural community in Shropshire, in England. One of the things that I remember noticing, even as a small child, was the the reciprocity between families, yeah, that different families would keep a pig, one pig, yeah, but when you killed a pig, there was far too much to eat, yeah. So all I know was that I wasn't allowed anywhere near the house when the slaughter and butchery took place, yeah. But what I do remember is that after it had all been cut up and so forth, there was considerable coming and going, whereby and then vice versa. At another time, there would be parcels arriving from somebody else, yeah. So there were, even when you've got household production, yeah, you still have, networks of sharing, which gives you food security. Yeah,
Yeah, very much so.
Mm.
Nigel has some remarks after Tobias. Please, Nigel.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Totally, Nigel. How are
Yes.
you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good to see you, Ian, and really enjoyable talk. I have a couple of remarks. One is that archaeologically, the number of documented storage features is really, really small. I think right through from the Natufian all the way through most of the Neolithic, there are very, very, very few sites where there's definitive evidence that the pits were used for storage. I mean, the basket that was just recovered from Wadi Morabat, which has a capacity of 90 plus liters, I think precisely shows the situation that you described from Dra, of reconstructing, but those sort of situations are very, very few and far between for above surface storage and so on. So I'm just worried that some of the numbers that we're not ending up building somewhat of a house of cards, which goes also for the whole thing of population estimates. I agree with you that we should be looking at the lower end of the possible community sizes and so on. But the other thing is that I see that even though we wrote a paper together, I think 4 years ago, we still have a disagreement about the early PPMB. It did not appear at all in any of your slides just now. And I think the period between about 8,600 Cal BC and 8,200, maybe 100, is absolutely critical, both in the northern Levant and in the southern Levant. And today we simply have large numbers of early PPMB sites, whereby one can definitely see that they have 1 foot in the PPNA and 1 foot in the PPMB. And I think that has to be recognized. And also, when you look at the sites in Anatolia, whether it's Bonchuklu or the beginnings of Ashikli, or the new site with Miraban and Gunis of Balikli, we're also dealing with precisely that period of time. And I think there's a tremendous amount of dynamic developments occurring at about that time. Yeah, but my main concern is that it's so difficult. I mean, they definitely did have storage, but it's so difficult to really get a grip on things. And I think there's a danger. There was a whole discussion in where was it, Current Anthropology, I think lately, with Brian Hayden, also to do with storage and stuff. just a year or so ago, which I think we need to be really, really careful about. I mean, certainly ethnography and so forth can be really, really useful, but we have to, I think, be very, very careful about what we're adopting.
I have no problems with what you're saying, Nigel. I have no problems at all. So a couple little pieces of background to some of that. One is, much to my amazement, I find myself much warmer towards your argument that you and I had, what was it, 26, 7, 8 years ago, as we were writing that piece.
Yeah.
I do think the early PPMB is a real thing. I do think there's a manifestation to it. And yeah, this is more a matter of thinking of data smoothing in some ways.
Yeah, but that's precisely the point. It's a quantum shift. I think the early PPMB.
Right. The point is, I don't think that changes the overall trajectory. I don't think when we think about the long term. So one could drop in some of those early PPMB stuff, which I haven't spent the time over the last month to do that. One could do that in some capacity, and I certainly will, because that makes a lot of sense. My hunch is it's probably not going to change the overall curve that we think about going from the Natufian to the pottery Neo. But we'll see as we sort of go through that in some capacity. Okay, there's that one. Coming back to what you were saying in terms of the limitations and the kind of assumptions, the operational assumptions and things like that. Oh, there's no doubt. There is a lot of assumptions built in on this, whether you're talking about the physical manifestations we see are below the surface or where things are slightly above the surface, the immateriality of storage and what we're missing. But there's a drive behind this, Nigel, and that is that if we as a group of Neolithic scholars don't deal with this, then we're going to continue to have pieces of work that are written about salmon helping us understand the Natufian, or we're going to have work done by people who are doing paleoeconomics where they don't understand what is the Neolithic in some capacity. So if we don't sort of dive into these kinds of questions, recognizing that we're having to absorb some operational assumptions, at least we can choose those assumptions and we can sort of get a sense of where's our comfort level with making those compromises. Because any kind of modeling, especially when you're dealing with deep time like this, we have to find a spot where we're comfortable with some of those assumptions. And I don't know where that soft zone is, but if we don't do it, other people are going to take that agenda away from us.
Okay, thank you.
Tobias, please.
Thanks, Nige.
Hi, Ian. Yes, thanks very much for this really interesting talk and perspective on storage. I wonder what, bearing in mind that a lot of the numbers may be tentative, and it's I guess you're seeing this more as a sort of a proposition based on the evidence that we have. Is all can all question whether we've excavated in the right areas and whether we found all the storage features and so forth. But taking your numbers at as what they are, what do you think is this? What does this do to the connection between storage and sedentism? I mean, if we're looking at the numbers you put out for the Natufian and the PPNA, if we accepted those numbers just for the argument's sake, it looks like these guys wouldn't have been able to be fully sedentary all year round, right? I mean, they wouldn't have had the storage facilities and the capacity to actually support that on those kind of resources alone. So that means they must have the environment must have been so incredibly rich at some points to enable that. And I kind of wonder if that is really ecologically possible, or they just couldn't have been. So I wonder what you make of that, that connection between the two.
So yeah, thanks, Tobias. Appreciate that. So two different pieces to it. One is the whole aspect of, should we say, the rich environment, and what you just laid out in some capacity, especially when we're talking about the Natufian PPNA, and sort of what is the potential, what's required for people to move around and to stay in one place. So I went back and I looked at George Wilcox's reply to Brian Hayden's little piece there. And I have a lot of time for George, obviously. And one of the things that he wrote is about sort of the rich environment. This demonstrates these, while there's no evidence for storage, and I'm paraphrasing him, while there's no real evidence for storage, clearly there was a rich environment where people had this, and could move around the landscape and take advantage of that. I don't have any disagreements with that. That makes sense to me in many ways. But it's also interesting that we are still, because of our lack of modeling, we're still using this in sort of this quantitative, not a quantitative way. We're still saying, oh, this is a rich environment, this is a poor environment. And we need to start thinking about how can we start getting a better sense of that. Sort of if you think of some of the earlier work in the 1960s and 70s with sort of carrying capacity ecological modeling, it was both a road that was sort of a bit of a dead end, but it was also something that was very productive. And I think it would be interesting to see where we are and how to engage with that. The next piece was sort of the sedentism, and my good colleague, Mr. Bill Finlayson, in his red jacket just showed up there. Yeah, Bill, amongst others, and Nige and other folks, have really sort of asked the question of what is it to be sedentary, and the whole aspect of what is sedentary in some capacity. And again, there are moments under which we use this as a binary term of the light bulb switch. We walk over and we flip the switch and it comes on and off. And yet we have to recognize that there must have been an awful lot more in the way of smaller task groups going off, other groups staying at certain points of time. And so it's not that sedentary and sort of mobility and sedentism are mutually exclusive in some form. We have to assume that there's a much more complex interdigitation between these different strategies and different age groups. So yeah, I think the kind of, and I assume, Bill, this is what you're going to be picking up on in some capacity, the whole question of, how many people, even in an LPPNB village, if we think of areas of Basta, for example, or if you want to roll up to Çatalhöyük, how many people need to be there to, shall we say, hold down the fort and keep the goats and the insects out of stored food? Probably not that many. So I think there's an awful lot more mobility, and in probably more nuanced, subtle ways than we really recognize at this point, Tobias.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Bill, please.
I can't hear you, Bill. You're muted forever.
No, it doesn't work.
Are you trying to speak in a Scottish accent?
Okay.
Can you try a different accent that I can hear? Do we want to give you a minute to find the right button to click? Yes. Okay.
Okay. So we can continue with Abi. Abi has a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Abi.
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for this lecture. Yeah, I wonder, adding on what Nigel was saying, which is what I think as well, I would like to ask a question. Why isn't the word domestication mentioned here? Because you mentioned low-level food production, which is an idea or a model that I'm not sure is very well fitting to the Near East. But if we talk about something at the very beginning of the PPNB, or even a bit later, within the first, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 years of the PPNB. Why isn't domestication taken into consideration? This is the time when plants and animals were domesticated.
There's no, I'm not ignoring it in any capacity, Avi, in a way that is, I am ignoring it, but the reason why I'm ignoring it is that in some ways, I think the whole aspect is the question of management of crops, management of animals. And domestication in many ways is really, think of it from a plant or an animal basis. It's a matter that we look at morphological remains of seeds or animal bones in some capacity. They reach a certain size, a certain robustness, or there's a hardness to the shell or something similar. I think the important part to that is it may be indicating that there's greater yield in some form. But in terms of behaviors of sort of management, I don't think it's as important, because people who have been managing crops, whether it's weeding, whether it's water, or whether it's with animals of some form, there's been this element of intervention in some capacity. I think the issue that you're right about is that it probably means that there's greater yield. There's greater amounts of food that are available in some capacity. But the trigger point of sort of saying, now we have domesticated emmer wheat versus now we have domesticated goat or sheep or goat, I think that's less important, because, well, it's not less important, but from my modeling standpoint and trying to wrestle with this, it's more a matter of thinking about these practices of management rather than the moment. Does that make sense, Avi?
It makes sense, because we disagree on that, and it's not a matter of a moment or centuries. It's a matter of archaeological resolution. We cannot talk about this year or next year or the year before. We can talk about a resolution that in good cases and in modern excavations is plus or minus 50 or 100. Maybe it can go better, as we've seen last week, to plus or minus 25. So this is what we can talk about. But if you look at the PPNA and then you look at the PPNB, I think domestication must have, or could have, if you wish, a very important role, because management might be a long-term thing that existed in human culture, but there is a moment where it changes, even for low-level food production in the Americas. But thank you anyway.
Of course, of course.
I think Bill solved the microphone problem. Bill?
Maybe, can you hear me now?
Totally, Bill, and I can understand your accent.
That's good. It's a new computer in a new office, and I've had to set it up all by myself because of COVID, so it was bound to go wrong.
It's a big challenge.
I'm afraid I'm going to go back slightly, and I'm sorry, Avi, I missed your question because I was wrapped up in technology. But going back to what Nigel came in on, which was the question of storage in the PPNA. And of course, I mean, it was one of the things we found at DRA was that first storage building, which I think, we didn't make a big thing at the time. We were concentrated on the architectural details, but it did have material in it. It had all the phytoliths and stuff that Emma Jenkins identified. So we're very happy with that. And then when I went on with Steve Meithner at WF16, we identified quite a lot of very similar bits of architecture, to the extent that at WF16, it looks like there's virtually no residence, and there's a lot of workspace, and there's a huge amount of storage space, which puts it way off your PPNA diagram. And even up at the site that Cheryl and I were talking about the other day, Sharara, we've got, again, some of these stones that look like they're designed for holding uprights, and we had bundles of dried figs that had come down from a burning roof. So again, it looks like PPNA storage may be much, much more common and extensive than we're reckoning. And it's one of the problems with all of these things, is that new data comes in almost the moment you write a paper afterwards. And I mean, I liked your comments on Brian Hayden's paper last year or this year. I thought it was 2020, but 2021, I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, that's, but the danger with that approach to some extent, the going into the sort of the scattergun ethnography and pulling in your dried salmon and comparing them with dentalium shells and so on. I mean, I think that's, dare I say it, you know, it's the risk with the sort of numeric ethnography. And I know you put yours very much more cautiously with lots of caveats and so on, but the worry is always that somebody's going to come along at the end, possibly Brian, pick up some of your endpoints and say these are the new facts and move on. So it can be a scary business. But moving on from that, the last thing really is this whole social context of storage. And I see Emma's put in a big comment about Paul Halstead's remarks about why farmers store. And it's not clear to me, you know, and Brian's the opposite. Brian argues it's all for surplus, for feasting and so on. So you have very different ideas. And I think we started talking about it at DRA, and it's something I've tried to carry on developing, is this idea that it's actually part of the whole structure of PPNA society, is this trying to, you know, as they're doing more and more collective harvesting on collectively produced crops, they're to some extent trying to create, I think rather than maintain, but create an egalitarian context for society. And that's actually their purpose. It's possibly not storage for food primarily, it's storage so that you have the material collectively placed in the open in these external bins. And it's very much like that slide you showed. I can't remember which one it was, the one next to the Zulu village, the community next to that with the granary of the house, you know, so you've got these things which are, but at DRA and Fanan, very open and accessible, I think very importantly visible to everybody else. You can see what people are going and getting in. And in the PPNB, you can no longer do that. It's not only taken inside, possibly for security, but it's taken inside so you can't see what people are accessing. And there is, I think, some point in the PPN, there is what Trevor was talking about a bit, is that you do have this big social change where you move into some sort of household type of organization. And it may, to some extent, just be a scaling up. And one of the issues, and you know, that with a lot of the PPNA sites is that they're so small that you could almost be dealing with a household-sized community. So the reason we may see that shift is a population scale change. So I thought I'd throw that into the mix and see what you made of it.
I'm in total agreement with you, both in terms of what you were saying about the PPNA, as well as the aspect of should we say the impact of storage in some capacity. The challenge, whether we're talking about the PPNB, the PPNA or the LPPNB, is that ultimately, when we're thinking about storage, we can use a little framing of it's there, it's not there, presence, absence. But ultimately, if we're going to try and think in terms of impact in some capacity, it's a relationship between what spaces we have, what's going inside, and the number of people. And the proximies, the sort of material products we use for that are that of number of buildings or something else that we can use. But that's that relationship. And when we think about WF16 or DRA or whatever context you want to think about, it's a matter of what's being stored and the number of people that are living around it, which is in some ways the same kind of thing in the LPPNB, in that we're still trying to think about storage volume and that of number of people. And that's the problem, is we don't understand. We really don't have a good understanding of demography and how demography changes for these different points of time. And therefore, how do we really layer that in terms of essentially the expectations of storage about, you either have normal storage, an excess, a surplus. We can't, even if we knew how much physical storage was taking place, come back to what Nigel was saying, everything above ground, below ground, even if we knew all of that, to understand the effectiveness in storage in some capacity, we need to understand the demography that's associated with this. And we don't at this point. So there's still those sort of that operational slippage in some ways for that.
Eleni? Hi.
Hi. I would like to raise, I actually put that comment on the chat about the importance of anticipating crop failure. It is a fact that, especially before the development of mixed agropastoral, even though small scale, household level, but yet still mixed agropastoral production systems. That is before the widespread adoption of domesticated crops plus domesticated animal caprine husbandry. Crop failure was a very, very important consideration, especially archaeobotanists who are on this group right now, but also ecologically minded people specializing in other aspects of the prehistoric archaeology of Southwest Asia know exactly what I'm talking about. Before early farmers had the prospect of enhancing the productivity of their cultivated plots through, for example, using of animal manure, the prospects of crop failure were very, very high, the chances of that, okay? So I am not going to examine here whether, pre-domestication or whatever one might wish to call it, crop production was important or not. I mean, they could have been important for all sorts of reasons, social as well as culinary reasons. You find clean stores of mustard seeds, millions of them, as late as ceramic Neolithic Çatalhöyük. So we cannot exclude culinary or other social drives in this respect. But I think that the anticipation of crop failure was probably a very important consideration in the development of early storage. And I think it is clear why visible versus non-visible storage probably becomes so manifestly important in later periods, as well as other considerations, like settlement sizes increase, group sizes increase, and the reliance on agropastoral products is a stable provider. You cannot risk crop failure or going without your mainstays of subsistence every 3 or 5 years. If you don't store at whatever level you're doing this, you're gonna go hungry. You're risking the survival of the group. Other than that, I would also like to, I loved the talk. I really, really liked Ian's focus on the macro evolutionary, if I may call it like that, perspective. But the pre-Neolithic periods are absent there. And I would like to at least put into consideration the know-how that Southwest Asian prehistoric societies must have accumulated through the pre-Neolithic periods when it comes to the management and processing and curation, if you want, of important resources such as nuts, for example, or even certain seed resources that we know were used way before the Neolithic revolution, so to speak, as well as processing methods that might have played an important role in, let's say, concepts of storage on the move or less move. Anyway, I'll stop there and I'll just, invite Ian if he wants to comment on any of this.
Yeah, I would just say that the thing I'd pick up on is the whole aspect of failure rates and the problems. It's absolutely remarkable when you start looking at the failure rates ethnographically and what takes place. So yeah, I'm in agreement with you. Definitely in agreement with you.
Mario, microphone. Your microphone.
Thanks a lot. This was very inspiring. And I think Avi made a good point about the domestication. And I hope I did not miss this point at the beginning of your talk because I couldn't attend it from the beginning onwards. I would just tell your attention to the domestication of humans. There is a cognitive thing going on. And yeah, if I did not miss it, you did not talk too much about this. You cannot store unless you do not share with everybody. And this is a very important point, I think, which has not been considered too much in this talk, I think. And I totally agree that with Ian that the domestication of animals and plants is just a very slow process from management. And in fact, the domestication, the biological domestication is just an epiphenomenon. For me, the most important point is that people stop to share with everybody, and you can't make up your herd unless you don't stop to share with everybody. So this is
what do you mean by stop to share? I don't quite know what you're
not stopping. General, you know this generalized sharing or sharing with everybody who comes into the group. And if you want to start a herd or store your food, it's not possible if everybody can come to you and ask, can you give me some food? And if you have these sharing networks, this is your a kind of storage if you want. But you have to reduce your sharing group or define a group with whom you share. So this is the important point for me in the social cognitive thing, which is very important in that aspect, I think. What do you think?
I totally agree. I think it's a matter of it's redefining those sharing networks. I think it's redefining, and that fits in terms of what we see in terms of the localization of mortuary practices in particular buildings, and the kind of individuality that we start to see in certain ways. So I think it's a redefinition of those sort of redefinition, reframing, I'm not quite sure, of those sort of social networks, and in terms of how sharing, and the moment we start talking about sharing, of course, we're really talking about identification and membership into some group, because membership, if you're given food, there's a membership element to it. So yeah, I agree 100%. I agree 100% with you. That is the critical flipping that takes place.
Thank you. Maurice has a remark, I think.
Thanks, Ian, for that nice talk. I think some general, remarks might be from the architectural point of view.
Of course.
Well, so it's like one thing I always have in mind is like permanent buildings does not mean permanent presence of people. So it's one of I think one of the triggers we are looking always in when it comes to storage of whatever we think about storage starts with permanent buildings. And then it means that over time might be people start to stay with these permanent stored items. Might be, and it's all about might be also seasonality of settlements. Like if we have at Stuttgart, we say it, we have the evidence that this settlement was only used with these permanent buildings seasonal. And you always wonder when does this kind of moment appears when people stay year round at a place. Might be another point, I think, I can't remember who mentioned it today, but it was I think Bill said some stuff is not visible anymore if you put it into a house, especially in the late PPNB. And I think sometimes we think of that if you store things inside a house, it's a bit like what Marion had in her talk about the burials and all the grave goods in a house. You might look more carefully in a neighborhood what people are actually carrying above or on the roofs, because we know people had then to move above the roofs, and you're much more visible than ever because you can't hide what you're actually bringing inside your house. And then you might do something with this. So it's and I disagree in this sense that all this architecture kind of somehow expresses very much a high control of access to stored items. Due to kind of the entrances to the buildings. And then you could argue, like in sites like MPP and B-side Scarp-Mesade, we have the, or Beta as well, we have entrances, horizontal entrances where you can walk into the building, fine. But what is with all these structures like at Chattal, at Barja, at Göbekli Tepe, which obviously only were accessible from the top. So you had to carry your stuff quite public to your building through entire settlement. And it's clearly that there is a control or kind of also visibility of what you are storing, and might be also creating some, not this well moods or kind of things in a society in such a settlement, just as a kind of brief. And then might be just one more point. I think you mentioned it, Ian, that it's all about might be stabilizing or kind of getting control over humidity and moisture when you want to store. So in this sense, Neolithic buildings are not that bad in this. And also, like if you go down to the southern Levant and you look at the thick walls of Basta, and you really think of, from an architectural point of view, this is an architecture that somehow excludes outside temperature. So you have a very controlled temperature environment inside the building, more or less, if you run a model with the same temperature all year round and almost the same humidity inside the roofs, because especially in Basta, we have these raised floors that keep away the ground moisture. And I think this is clearly what you expressed in the direction of kind of like perfect storage buildings for whatever.
Yeah, there's no doubt, whether you're talking about Basta or Esfaya or some of the other sites where you have drainage channels, you have, as you said, big high walls, you have second story entrance from up above. Yeah, Gary, years and years ago, I don't know if Gary's on here, but years and years ago, Gary wrote an article, I think it was in '87, where he talked about some of the LPP&B stuff that they found at Ain Ghazal. And one of the buildings, he talked about it, where it was essentially an LPP&B subdivision of a middle PP&B structure. And he published it and referred to it as a storage bunker. And from a humidity and temperature standpoint, that is one of the byproducts. That is one of the byproducts of it. Yeah, so I'm in agreement with you there. Coming back to what you were saying in terms of, should we say, the social performance of storage, because that's an important element, people being able to see what's being brought in, where you store things. I'm in agreement with you that that's a possibility and that's an important thing to think about. But in some ways, my interest at this point, and recognizing that there's unquestionably a performative element to food. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about feasting, whether you're talking about people watching you bring in the shopping bags into the household, something similar. Yeah, there's a performative element to food, feasting, all the rest of it. I'd like to know more about just the basic elements of how many people could have lived on some of that. You know, the fact that we don't really understand some of that, that's frustrating. You know, there's no blame, there's no guilt, there's none of those little pieces. But that is something that'd be really nice if we could just advance those conversations, because whether you're talking about the performance of it, or Marion, what you were talking about in terms of sort of performance in social networks in some capacity, it in some ways does come down to shelf life, the number of people that can eat, and some of our conversations, I think, have sort of stalled out with that in some capacity. Yeah. Nigel, are you still there? Nigel Going Morris? Oh, he had left his screen on and he turned his screen off and he went to the refrigerator for a beer. That's what he's done. That's what he done. He just got busted. Okay.
Okay. I think Yufeng, are you here? Okay. Nigel, Yufeng.
Sorry about that.
Okay, please, Yufeng.
I just have just curious about whether this article has been published. Does Kuijt? I want to know about more details about it.
I'd like to know more details about it as well. I was working on it. I was working on it this morning until about 10 minutes before. No, this hasn't been published. I've made reference to some of the illustrations that I've published. I've done some additional illustrations there. No, this is an attempt to try and pull some things together that sort of build from some of this data and to understand where some of this is going. That was the intent of that. So no, yeah, I'd really like to be able to write this up, and I'd like to be able to shop it around to different people. And I'd like to send it to current anthropology so that it stands in opposition to some of the stuff that Brian Hayden wrote about last year.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kuijt, and we're looking forward to that.
Thank you, thank you. Anna, hi. Anna has a question.
Yeah, well, I would like to make a comment. As Ian knows, Nigel and me actually wrote a comment on the paper by Brian Hayden in that famous counter-anthropology article. But what I find disturbing in is this kind of, well, I suppose we are all doing it unconsciously, the linearity. You know, you start presenting the Natufian and then you add up a little bit or a lot with the PPNA, and then you move on to the PPNB. And I do believe that it was, well, at least I can't say for sure that it was different, but I think we have to keep in mind that the Natufians, for all their work of being, you know, just one step before the Neolithic, weren't just, you know, small Neolithic people in the sense of young Neolithics who later grew up and became full-fledged Neolithics. I mean, maybe the whole story doesn't apply to them in this kind of linearity. You know what I mean? In that sense, we, in a way, we're the same sinners, if I may use the term, like Brian, we're trying, you know, Brian Hayden, we're trying to arrange it all, you know, because if you think about the Natufians, and that's something that relates to what Tobias was mentioning, I think their problems, if I may say so, or what is so apparent with the Natufians vis-a-vis the storage, is that we know that they were sedentary of some kind, yet we don't have any storage facilities whatsoever. Maybe one pit that people are quarreling about. Yeah. And they didn't know that they will end being Neolithic. So maybe the whole, and it also social behavior and their social awareness and their social demands were different. And it also, so maybe in that sense, they weren't just, you know, the beginning of the Neolithic vis-a-vis the storage and the accumulation through time. Just like what Avi said about the domestication, I agree also that it was a huge change. It was a turnover. I think I permit myself to use the term psychological turnover, and things change socially. So what I'm afraid of is this kind of comfort in linearity, in presenting it in a linear way. You know, when let's say the Natufian are the children, the PPNA are the adolescents, and the PPNB, lo and behold, are the grown-up. So we should be really very careful not to become Brian Hayden ourselves.
Oh, Anna, I have always attempted not to become Brian Hayden. So thank you for encouraging me once again. No, there's no doubt that that's the problem with any kind of long durée conversation in terms of our modeling. And that is that there is a dimension under which we can slip into that kind of progressive conversation of evolutionary development, going from the Natufian, et cetera, going through that. There's no doubt, I think you're totally right. There's no doubt that when you think of the Natufian, early and late, and any other phrases you want to put in there, that's a very different game. And it is something that we have to think about as being different. That's the weakest part of any of playing of this. But I wanted to start, as I was trying to get my head around this, I wanted to start with that partially because of some people's arguments about the Natufian and that there is surplus and that there's lots of dancing warriors and cannibalism and chiefs and all the rest of it. So that argument in some ways has to start by, I'm not saying downplaying what's taking place in the Natufian, but being clear about there's no systematic evidence for food storage in the Natufian. So yes, I'm in agreement with you. In fact, you know, when I come to try and wrestle with some of this and write it up, I'll probably frame it as something more along the lines of the PPNA through to the LPPNB and try to think of that as a framework of conversation. That's probably where I'll go with that, Anna, with those different pieces. Now, Anna, I have one other quick question for you. And that is, what is one word that I never used for the entire presentation today?
EPPNB.
That's true. What's another word? I made Trevor a wager that I could go the entire presentation without using one specific word. Burial. I didn't use the word once in here, and I thought it'd be interesting to see if I could do that and just talk about storage. So yeah, early PPNB and burial.
And
Well,
domestication.
actually, you refer to it when you were responding to questions.
I used the word mortuary, not burial, because I knew Trevor was going to listen.
Sorry about it. You're right.
Yeah, but that doesn't count because mortuary is a byword for burial, Ian. So you're cheating there.
Well.
50-50.
Okay. Hi, Luis. Luis, I think Luis has a comment or a question. Please, Luis.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry. I know everyone's tired and probably wants to finish, but I thought I couldn't let it pass without taking up on his challenge where he says people need to think about plants and animals together. And I don't want to lead us off into a completely different tack because I know, you know, your presentation was really focused on the plant story, which I really appreciate. I found it very, very stimulating. But when we come to looking at earlier aspects of storage, we had a PhD student who did a very interesting project, convincingly arguing for a lot of animal product storage, right from about 19,000 in Karana 4, with consistent, Natalie's been finding this as well, I know, for a long time. So you've got the animal fats, the animal greases, which get stored, and I think the patterns that we're finding all the way through the late Pleistocene and through the early Holocene show that animal products are probably being stored, and the capacity to store them over winters for 6 months is what Anna Spiro has been writing about, combined with fruits and berries and so forth. So there's long-term storage there. You can't live off animal products alone, clearly, although when you look at teenage you can think that they can be completely carnivorous for long periods of time with no fruit and vegetables. So, you know, that's all debatable. But, you know, I sort of agree with the people who say that once you come into the middle ppmb and that kind of clear capacity to store animal fats and animal products then leads you directly into domestication, where all of the, you know, some evidence now is that as soon as animals were domesticated, they're on the hoof for dairy products. So we're into another kind of storage. Okay, you've got. I'm just thinking about those seasonal gaps that you're talking about and how they're going to be buffered. So you then got a whole dairy products coming in. So yeah, we're talking about plants, but in terms of, I think the story needs to be looked at together, because the sites that Shebeka, for example, in the Natufian, Wadi Hammer, the whole broad spectrum revolution arguments are really showing that you've got a whole host of animal products being used year round. You know, you've got large flocks of birds, water birds, which are filling in winter in Shebeka, as they are in Bonshufu. So I suppose from an animal perspective, I'm not seeing the seasonal gap. And I'm seeing a huge ability to store, which is going to be invisible in baskets, in houses, in all that kind of thing. These are probably going to be hanging from the ceiling in leather, you know, in leather packs. And I'm reminded of some contexts we found in Çatalhöyük in the early days, which were clearly the feet of animals which had fallen from the rafters, which suggested either a liquid or something being stored hanging up. And the whole thing was collapsed in a sealed deposit. So just to throw in some other ideas to your mix.
I think it's all about fat. I mean, to be honest, when you start looking at First Nation groups, when you look at sort of seasonal problems, when you look at sort of compatibility, like John Spett's book, which is a great book that he did on paleo hunting, and he's got that entire chapter on fat and the use of fat. Yeah, I think it makes total sense. How we get to it, residue analysis, other things like that, I don't know. But I agree 100%, because it's got to be that kind of compatibility that was going on in some form. Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you, Louise.
Thank you. And Rosalia has a question. Rosalia, do you want to ask? Hi, Rosalia.
Hello. Hello. I wrote the question. What I do not know is while modeling the storage, one takes into consideration data that come from the way plants were processed prior to storage and how much this affected the ways, the techniques of storage. And if these techniques vary in the regions examined, how much one can use this kind of data?
I think it's critical. I don't know how one can use it. There's been, Bob Bettinger's work is great with this. Winterhalter's done some work with this as well. So there's a number of people that have tried to look at this. Lucas Barton, another one who's sort of looked at that sort of ecological approach to that. The whole question of not only what kind of processing is taking place, but also that of how much energy is involved in front loading the processing versus that of at the end. That's a really big one in terms of sort of decision making and how you deal with these things. Yes. Yeah, there's an awful lot of potential. This kind of modeling would involve a lot more in the way of assumptions about that. That's another big part of it is essentially how were people able to prepare these accumulated resources, these things they harvested, be it drying them, be it taking off the seeds, be it leaving the seeds on, be it silking it in water and then drying it, all these different pieces that involve time and energy, but potentially allow for it to be stored longer or more food value to come out of it. Yeah, there's a lot of bigger energetics conversations that need to take place.
Ordered excuse me, the value this according to the processing they have, if the food has different value at the end of the day.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit, so I couldn't hear some of the question there.
Then comes also, this is the evaluation of the processed food. Now I think of it just like that. That comes to my mind. And even different sites or regions, the way they evaluate, the value they give to the food is not the same.
Yeah, and we could take that same argument in terms of different places in the Neolithic at one point of time, let alone how it changes regionally from place to place. I would assume that there were differences in terms of how these things took place and why. Coming back to what Louise was saying, something I was going to touch on. We've always recognized the number of waterfowl in some of these PP&A sites. And one of the big pieces to them is ducks have fat and waterfowl has fat. So it's not just that there's some good protein with them, it's a matter that they taste good, and there's also this thing called fat. So that sort of makes sense as well.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay. I think last question, Miguel.
Thank you. Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Miguel.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I was thinking and just following Rosalia's comment on processing. I was thinking about prepared food, like created, transferred food. Because normally we think about seed storage, maybe from the plants or archaeobotanical point of view, but created cakes or that sort of food can be also stored. And I wonder if in the early periods, we not underestimate, but we can see that sort of storage maybe, like pastes and I have an image of today's house in the village next to Işıklı. Ladies were making very thin paste and putting them on top of each other for winter use, and there were maybe 500 leaves made of wheat flour, something like that. So I don't know if that sort of storage is underestimated somehow. And I don't know. I just wanted to, yeah.
I think that's a great point. I think you're dead right. It probably is something that's underestimated. And it comes back to what Louise was saying, things such as pemmican, where you have meat that's been chopped up and pounded, mixed in with berries, mixed in with fat. Essentially, it's a hybrid of sort of meat and berry jerky that's then dried, and it can be in blocks in some form, let alone, as you said, dried cakes in some capacity. Yeah, it makes sense that there'd be those kinds of things that would be done in the summer when one could do that, and to combine those and have them the kind of thing that could be used and kept for November, December, January, February. Yeah, it makes total sense.
Thank you.
Any comments or question? Okay.
Can I ask the last question?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, I just was wondering about because you showed us concerning your last slide, in which you presented and highlighted some issue that you're gonna to think about it in future and talk about them. And so I was wondering about the possible impact of climatic events in the Neolithic. Do you think any possible relationship between the climate event, for example, specifically the 9.2 event, which was coincided more or less with the late 8th millennium BC, and if I'm not mistaken, it was during this period or time that storage was increased. Do you think any possible relationship between these two?
I haven't considered it in terms of what I was doing, sort of modeling over the last couple of weeks to try and think some of those things through. I think it's entirely possible. I'm not so sure that the impact would be that of storage itself and sort of the viability of storage, things like relative humidity, et cetera, so much as that of how much is produced in terms of the amount. Does increased rainfall allow for greater crop growth and greater production? You know, basically, is there a greater frequency of good seasons of growth versus that of seasons of alternating bad growth and good growth? So I'd have to think further about it. It's a really good question. My hunch is that if there was going to be an impact, it would probably be that of production of the crops rather than something related to the technology itself in terms of preservation conditions. But then here, we could take it the other way, and that is, if you have more food, you now need more storage. You spend the time developing new ways to store things to take advantage of that climatic change that's occurred. So yes, it could totally be layered into that. Yeah, very good question. Thank you.
Thank you.